My name is Rachel Miller. I am 29 years old, and last Christmas my father stood at the head of the dining table, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. He raised his glass and declared, "Sons are the backbone of any family. Daughters are a burden. Thank God for Daniel, who carries our name with pride." The room erupted in claps and nods, cousins cheering, uncles grinning, and even my mother bowed her head in silence as though she agreed. I sat there, my fork trembling in my hand, my chest tight, the turkey on my plate untouched. In that instant, I felt the same sting I had carried since childhood, that no matter what I achieved, I was invisible. My father's words were not new, but hearing them in front of the entire extended family was like being stripped bare, humiliated for existing. My brother Daniel, lounging in his chair with a smirk, basked in the spotlight as if he had single-handedly rescued our lineage. He leaned closer and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Face it, Rachel, you will never matter. Dad's right. You are just the daughter." My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms, and for a moment I thought I would shatter right there. All the years of hard work, the sleepless nights building a career in New York, the sacrifices I had made to stand on my own 2 feet, none of it mattered to them. They believed the lie Daniel had fed them, that he was the savior of the family, the one who saved the house from foreclosure, the one who carried the weight. And I, the so-called useless daughter, was painted as nothing more than an afterthought. My father lifted his glass higher, his tone swelling with pride as he said, "To Daniel, the son who proved that blood and honor rest with men." His words echoed against the walls burning into my memory. The cousins raised their glasses, my aunts nodded in approval, and even my mother's silence was louder than any applause. I swallowed the knot in my throat, my heart pounding with fury, but in that moment, instead of collapsing, I felt something harden inside me. They had no idea the truth was sitting right in front of them, waiting to explode. They had no idea that while they praised Daniel for accomplishments he never earned, I was the one who had quietly carried their burden, the one who had signed the papers, the one who had bought back the very house we were dining in. They called me useless, but I was the reason the roof stood above their heads. And as I stared at their smug faces, the rage and betrayal coursing through me sharpened into clarity tonight. I would let the truth shatter their illusion. Tonight, they would learn what it meant to underestimate a daughter. Before I take you through everything that led to that night, let me pause and ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? I know many of you have lived long enough to see favoritism tear families apart, to see words spoken by parents cut deeper than knives. If you have ever been overlooked or dismissed just because you were a daughter or because someone else was praised while you were ignored, then you already know how painful it feels to sit at a table where your worth is erased. I want you to share your story in the comments. Tell me where you are tuning in from, and let us build a space where truth and dignity matter more than outdated traditions. And if you believe in justice, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss what happened when I finally revealed the truth. I was born and raised in a small town in Pennsylvania, a place where the church bells rang every Sunday morning and the neighbors waved from their porches. But behind the painted fences and polite smiles, there were rules that never bent. In our household, those rules were carved in stone by my father, Richard Miller, who believed with his whole heart that sons were investments and daughters were expenses. My mother, Helen, carried that belief like a shadow, never questioning him, never speaking out, her silence sealing the judgment on my life before I even had a chance to live it. When my brother Daniel was born 2 years before me, he was hailed as the savior of the family name. Neighbors came by with gifts. My father passed cigars at the factory, and he told everyone, "My son will carry my blood forward." When I was born, no one celebrated. My father barely looked at me, muttering to my mother that she had failed him. From the beginning, I was the daughter who did not count. Growing up, the imbalance was obvious in every corner of our lives. Daniel had a room filled with toys, trophies, and posters of sports heroes, while I shared a cramped space with boxes of old linens. At 16, Daniel was given a used car, rusty but his to drive wherever he pleased, while I was told to walk to learn humility. If Daniel came home with a passing grade, my father clapped him on the back and called him brilliant. If I brought home straight A's, my father barely lifted his eyes from the newspaper and said, "A girl with grades is still just a girl." The words stung not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had always known in his eyes: I was invisible. The favoritism spilled into every family gathering. At Thanksgiving, relatives asked Daniel about football practice while I sat quietly, my stories about science fairs and scholarships swallowed by the noise of their praise. At Christmas, Daniel's gifts were shiny and new: a bicycle, a stereo, while mine were practical socks and a sweater too large for me. My mother never fought for me. She only whispered, "Be patient. Rachel, life is easier if you do not argue." But I argued in silence in the locked pages of a notebook my grandmother Margaret gave me when I turned 12. She was the only one who saw me, who leaned close and whispered, "You have a mind sharper than your father realizes. Write your plans. Hold on to your dreams. One day you will show them." I wrote in that notebook every night, pouring in my frustrations, my anger, my ambitions. I sketched dreams of becoming more than a forgotten daughter, dreams of building a future with my own hands. When my grandmother passed away, I kept the notebook tucked under my pillow. Her faith in me, the only shield I had against the constant erosion of my worth. Still, the wounds deepened as I grew older. Daniel was always excused for his failures. He lost jobs, quit classes, and spent money recklessly, yet my father proudly told everyone his son was destined for greatness. I, on the other hand, was told to lower my voice, to help in the kitchen, to prepare myself for the day I would marry and become someone else's burden. The hypocrisy burned. I wanted to scream that I was capable, that I was more than the role they assigned me, but screaming would only prove them right in their eyes, so I swallowed it and turned it into fuel. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the muffled sound of my father and mother talking through the walls, my father saying, "Daniel will take care of us in our old age. Rachel will just leave." Those words carved scars so deep I can still hear them echoing. But instead of breaking me, they became my resolve. If my father insisted daughters were useless, I would make myself indispensable. If he wanted to erase me, I would write my name in letters too bold to ignore. The world outside our house was different. Teachers noticed me. One in particular, Mrs. Harris, pulled me aside after class and said, "Rachel, do not let anyone tell you your mind does not matter. You have a gift with numbers." Her words lit a fire. I devoured math textbooks, entered competitions, and won medals that gathered dust in a drawer because my father refused to hang them on the wall. But even as they gathered dust, I knew they were proof that my life would not be confined by his prejudice. By the time I reached high school graduation, I had already decided I would leave that small town. I would chase the opportunities they never believed I deserved. When my father clapped Daniel on the back at my graduation party, telling relatives that his son would go far, I stood quietly with my acceptance letter to New York University hidden in my purse. They did not know, and I did not tell them. Let them think I was nothing. One day they would see. The only person who ever stood between me and the crushing weight of my father's words was my grandmother, Margaret. She was my mother's mother, a woman of quiet strength with silver hair pinned in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through the walls my father built around me. While everyone else dismissed me, she leaned close and whispered truths I clung to like oxygen. When I was 12, she pressed a weathered leather-bound notebook into my hands. "Write your plans, Rachel," she said, her voice low but steady. "Do not let anyone steal your future. Someday you will prove them wrong." That notebook became my sanctuary. On nights when my father told me to stay in the kitchen while Daniel went out to play, I scribbled down equations and dreams of building something greater than the confines of our small town. When I brought home straight A's and my father muttered that it was meaningless, I filled page after page with the vow that one day he would eat those words. My grandmother's house was the only place where I felt seen. She would pour me tea in a chipped porcelain cup and listen as I talked about my love for numbers. She nodded thoughtfully, telling me about women in her generation who had been denied education, who had been forced to abandon their ambitions at the altar of tradition. "You are living the future we never had," she told me once, her hands trembling slightly as she patted mine. "Carry us forward. Do not surrender." Her belief in me was like armor. At family gatherings, when my father boasted about Daniel's football games and ignored my science fair ribbons, my grandmother would catch my eye from across the table and smile, a silent reminder that I was not invisible. When she fell ill during my teenage years, I sat by her bed reading aloud from the finance section of the newspaper. She listened weak but attentive and whispered, "Remember, knowledge is a form of power they cannot take away." The day she passed, I felt the ground vanish beneath me. At her funeral, while my father shook hands and Daniel laughed with cousins, I stood at the graveside clutching that notebook as though it was the last thread tying me to someone who believed. That night alone in my room, I opened the notebook and wrote through tears, "I will not fail you, Grandma. I will prove that daughters are not useless. I will prove it to them, to the world, and to myself." That promise became the compass guiding every step I took after. In the darkest moments, when my father's disdain cut deep, when my mother's silence made me feel abandoned, when Daniel's smirk made me want to disappear, I returned to those pages. They reminded me I was not crazy, not worthless, not doomed. I had a purpose, and I had someone who once believed I could achieve it. Even years later, when I boarded a bus to New York City with 2 suitcases and barely enough money to last a week, the notebook was packed safely in my bag. It was more than paper and ink. It was my grandmother's voice urging me forward, telling me I was more than my father's prejudice, more than my mother's silence, more than my brother's shadow. She was gone, but her faith lived on in me, fueling the fire that would one day set the truth ablaze. When I finally left for New York, it was not with a celebration or a family send-off. It was with a bus ticket I bought from months of babysitting and late-night tutoring and a single duffel bag packed with second-hand clothes, a stack of textbooks, and my grandmother's notebook tucked deep inside. My father scoffed when he noticed me leaving that morning, muttering, "You will be back within a month. A girl like you will not survive out there." My mother stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands wringing a dish rag, but she said nothing, and Daniel smirked from the couch, twirling car keys that had been handed to him without question. No one hugged me goodbye. No one wished me luck. The silence as I walked out the door was louder than any words could have been. The first months in New York were brutal. I juggled classes at the university with 3 part-time jobs. During the day, I worked at the campus library shelving books until my back ached. In the evenings, I manned the counter at a coffee shop, memorizing the orders of regular customers and learning how to smile, even when exhaustion threatened to swallow me. At night, I logged into spreadsheets freelancing as a data entry clerk for a small firm that paid pennies per hour, but gave me just enough to keep the lights on in the cramped apartment I shared with 2 strangers. I lived on instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, stretching every dollar until it nearly broke. There were nights when I cried quietly into my pillow, my body trembling with fatigue, my father's words replaying in my head like a cruel chorus. Daughters are useless. But each time I opened my grandmother's notebook, I saw my promise to her scrawled in shaky teenage handwriting, and I pulled myself together. I studied harder than anyone in my class, turning assignments into opportunities to push deeper, to outpace, to prove I belonged. Professors noticed. One of them, a stern woman named Dr. Patel, called me after class and said, "Rachel, you have an instinct for finance that cannot be taught. Do not waste it." Those words stuck with me, another small echo of belief to fight against the decades of dismissal. While Daniel bragged about his social life back home and coasted from one odd job to another, I was burning myself alive to build a foundation. And slowly, painfully, it began to pay off. I earned scholarships, won academic awards, and by my junior year landed a coveted internship at a financial firm in Manhattan. The offices were glass and steel, a world away from the peeling paint of my childhood home, and stepping inside felt like crossing into another universe. I worked harder than anyone else there, arriving before sunrise, leaving after midnight, absorbing every lesson, every detail. When other interns complained about the hours, I remembered the nights my father said my mind was worthless and pushed through, determined to silence his voice once and for all. By the time I graduated, I had an offer letter in hand, a salary that dwarfed anything Daniel had ever touched, and a clear path forward. But I kept my success to myself. I sent postcards home, brief notes about school, but never mentioned the awards, the internship, or the job. My father never asked. He only spoke of Daniel, his struggles framed as noble efforts, his failures softened by excuses. Once, during a rare phone call, I told my father I had been offered a full-time position. He laughed. They must be desperate to hire a girl like you. Enjoy it while it lasts. The words cut deep, but instead of answering, I hung up and let silence be my reply. Over the years, the distance grew. Daniel floundered cycling through jobs, borrowing money he never repaid and sinking deeper into debt. My father shielded him, calling him a man finding his way. Meanwhile, I rose steadily in my career, climbing from analyst to associate, then to manager. I rented my own small apartment in Brooklyn, paid off my student loans, and began building savings that most people my age could only dream of. Each milestone I reached, I marked in my grandmother's notebook, not to boast, but to remind myself that the promises I made at her grave were being fulfilled one by one. Yet even with all this progress, the ache of their dismissal never left me. Every promotion, every bonus, every long night spent proving myself felt like a letter I wanted to mail back home saying, "See, I am not useless." But I never sent it. I wanted the day of reckoning to come face to face. I wanted to stand before them in the house where I had been ignored and make them swallow their words. I dreamed of that confrontation not with cruelty, but with the clarity of someone who had earned her place in the world through fire and grit. I was not rushing toward revenge, but building toward justice. And justice I knew would be sweeter if it arrived when they least expected it. By the time I turned 27, my life in New York bore no resemblance to the girl my father dismissed as useless. I had carved a place for myself in one of the most competitive industries in the world. I was promoted to senior financial manager at a firm where only a fraction of analysts ever climbed that high. My salary rising into six figures, my office overlooking the skyline of Manhattan with its endless towers of glass and ambition. My name was printed on reports that executives studied my strategies, shaping million-dollar decisions. On paper, I was a success story, a daughter who had defied every expectation. But back home in Pennsylvania, none of it mattered. My father still spoke as if I were a burden. My mother remained silent, and Daniel, with his careless grin and empty pockets, continued to be hailed as the family's pride. I returned home occasionally not because I felt welcome, but because part of me still longed for recognition. Each visit was a reminder that nothing had changed. At Thanksgiving one year, I walked in wearing a tailored suit I had bought after a bonus, my briefcase still filled with spreadsheets from a project that had consumed me for months. The moment I entered the conversation shifted to Daniel's latest misadventure, a failed car dealership he had sunk borrowed money into. My father clapped him on the back, calling it a noble attempt as though failure was bravery simply because it belonged to a son. When I mentioned my promotion, the table fell silent for a moment before my father muttered, "It is just numbers on paper. Real success is building a family." The words struck like a slap. I wanted to scream that my work built futures, that my strategies kept businesses alive, that I was more than worthy. Instead, I swallowed the fury, knowing the moment of truth would come, and it would not be in a quiet kitchen conversation, but in a room full of witnesses. I began to plan my silence as carefully as I planned my investments. At work, my reputation grew. Clients asked for me by name. Colleagues envied my precision, and my bosses trusted me with accounts that carried risks higher than some entire companies. I thrived in the challenge, using every ounce of discipline that had been forged in the fire of my father's rejection. Each signed contract, each deal closed, was not just a professional milestone, but another stone laid in the foundation of the justice I would one day deliver. I bought my first apartment in Brooklyn, modest but entirely mine, and filled it with furniture chosen not for appearances but for comfort, each piece a symbol of independence. I traveled for work, sitting in boardrooms in Chicago, Los Angeles, even London, speaking with authority that younger me could never have imagined. And yet every success was haunted by the echo of my father's disdain. No matter how high I climbed, I still heard his voice saying, "Daughters are useless." That refrain followed me even into triumph, sharpening my determination rather than dulling it. Meanwhile, Daniel spiraled further. He had squandered every opportunity handed to him, falling deeper into debt with each failed scheme. He borrowed from relatives, from friends, from anyone gullible enough to believe his promises, and when he could not repay, my father stepped in with excuses, shielding him from consequence. "He just needs more time," my father would say, while I listened quietly, my stomach twisting with disbelief. More time had never been offered to me. More patience had never been extended to me. My successes were minimized while Daniel's failures were excused. The imbalance was staggering, and yet they clung to it blind to the truth standing in front of them. I began to see the irony. The daughter they dismissed had become the one thing they desperately needed, though they refused to admit it. Bills piled up at home, the mortgage slipping into arrears, medical expenses gnawing at what little savings they had. My father still spoke proudly of Daniel providing for them, but behind the curtain, I knew better. Quietly through channels they never traced, I had started covering payments. I sent money through anonymous transfers, keeping their house afloat, paying the debts that would have swallowed them whole. They believed Daniel was their savior, and he let them believe it, soaking in the praise while I carried the weight. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy. I wanted them to believe the illusion until the day I shattered it with evidence so undeniable it would echo louder than every insult, every dismissal. That day was coming. Each transfer I made, each bill I covered, each sacrifice I endured in secret was a piece of ammunition. I was building toward the moment when I would no longer be silent. They thought daughters were useless, but the roof above their heads, the stability they bragged about, was all thanks to me. The day they discovered that truth, the walls of favoritism would collapse and they would be forced to face what they had done. The cracks in their illusion began to show long before they admitted it. My father still puffed his chest at family gatherings, boasting of Daniel's supposed achievements, but I started to notice the hesitation in his voice, the way his eyes darted when bills were mentioned. Daniel walked around with bravado, spinning tales of investments about to pay off, but I saw the desperation behind his grin. He was drowning in debt and clutching at any rope he could find. The house I grew up in, once a symbol of my father's pride, had begun to deteriorate. The paint peeled from the porch, the roof leaked in storms, and letters from creditors piled on the kitchen counter. Still, he clung to the narrative that Daniel was their savior, refusing to acknowledge that the steady flow of money keeping them afloat came from me. My mother looked thinner, the lines on her face deeper, her silence heavier. She never questioned the sudden reprieves from foreclosure, never asked why the utilities were miraculously paid. Instead, she allowed my father to believe in the fiction that Daniel had somehow provided. I watched all of it from a distance, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect them but expose them. The tension grew heavier each time I visited. One evening, I stopped by unannounced, walking into the living room where Daniel lounged with his feet on the coffee table, a beer in hand, while my mother quietly sewed a tear in his jacket. My father barked at her to hurry, praising Daniel for having the courage to take risks. I stood there, my coat still on, feeling like an intruder in my own home. When I asked how they were managing the bills, my father waved his hand dismissively. "Daniel has it under control," he said. "You would not understand. You only play with numbers in an office." The words burned. I had just returned from a meeting where I presented strategies worth millions, strategies that executives had applauded. And yet here I was, reduced to nothing in his eyes. My mother avoided my gaze, and Daniel smirked, enjoying the theater of it. But I knew the truth, that without my anonymous payments, they would have lost everything months ago. As their struggles deepened, the pressure mounted. Creditors called daily threatening legal action. Daniel grew more erratic, his stories less convincing. He borrowed from shady acquaintances, promising returns that never came. Once I overheard him whispering on the phone, his voice low and panicked, begging for more time. My father's face hardened as he defended Daniel, insisting to anyone who would listen that his son was misunderstood. But the mask was slipping. The proud man who once declared daughters useless was reduced to clinging to lies, his pride rotting from the inside out. When Thanksgiving arrived that year, the tension reached its peak. Relatives gathered in the dining room, the table heavy with food, but the air was suffocating. My father raised his glass to toast Daniel, proclaiming him the backbone of the family. The words hung hollow in the air. I watched cousins exchange uneasy glances, whispers passing down the table. They had begun to suspect what my parents refused to admit. Daniel basked in the attention, but his hands shook as he lifted his drink, his facade crumbling. My mother's eyes darted to me, and for the first time I saw something crack in her silence, a flicker of shame. She knew. She had always known. But knowing and speaking were two different things, and she remained trapped in her role as the quiet wife of a domineering man. That night, as I drove back to the city, the decision crystallized. Their struggle had become undeniable, their lies unsustainable. It was time to prepare for the reveal. I would not simply tell them the truth. I would show them with evidence so undeniable it would break through every wall of denial they had built. The house, the bills, the roof over their heads, all of it had been saved by the daughter they called worthless. And soon, in front of every relative who had ever watched them belittle me, I would make sure they finally saw it. Christmas that year carried a heaviness that wrapped itself tighter than the winter air outside. Snow clung to the roofs. Lights blinked in neighbors' windows, and carols drifted faintly from radios, but inside my parents' house, the atmosphere was charged brittle, waiting to snap. I walked up the icy path to the front door with my heart pounding, a folder tucked under my arm, its contents the silent witness of years of truth. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, familiar scents that once brought comfort, but now layered themselves over decades of bitterness. When I stepped inside, the chatter dimmed for a moment. Dozens of relatives filled the dining room coats draped over chairs, glasses clinking. My father stood at the head of the table, his voice already booming as he bragged about Daniel's incredible year, spinning a fantasy about business ventures that had never existed. Daniel smirked, his arm draped lazily over his chair, basking in the praise. My mother moved silently between kitchen and table, her face pinched, her hands trembling as she set down dishes. I felt every eye glance at me, some curious, some pitying, some complicit in years of silence. I took my seat quietly waiting. Dinner unfolded in waves of conversation, laughter, forced tension crawling under the surface. Every story my father told was a fabrication, every cheer for Daniel an echo of lies. I stayed still, my fingers grazing the edge of the folder, the promise of revelation humming beneath my calm exterior. Then my father rose with his glass. Tonight, he declared, his voice thick with pride, we honor the son who has carried this family on his shoulders. Daniel has been our protector, our provider, our pride. Without him, we would not have survived this year. Applause rang around the table, though muted, hesitant. My pulse quickened. This was the moment. I stood slowly, the scrape of my chair cutting through the noise. All eyes turned to me. My father frowned, irritated by the interruption. Daniel's smirk faltered. I held the folder tightly, my voice steady, though my heart thundered. You say Daniel carried this family. I began, each word measured, but the truth is different. A murmur rippled across the room. My father's face flushed. Sit down, Rachel, he snapped. Do not ruin this night with your jealousy. I ignored him and opened the folder, pulling out the first stack of documents, mortgage statements stamped with payments traced to accounts that bore my name. I laid them flat on the table where everyone could see. The house. I said, my voice cutting through the silence, was weeks from foreclosure. Daniel did not save it. I did. Gasps broke out. My mother froze the dish in her hands, slipping and shattering against the floor. My father's mouth opened closed, then opened again, struggling for words. Daniel leaned forward, his face paling. I pulled out the next set: utility bills, credit card balances, debts erased quietly by my transfers. Every bill you thought Daniel paid, every dime you believed he earned it, was me. The daughter you called useless. The daughter you ignored. The room erupted in whispers, relatives leaning in to see the papers, eyes wide with shock. My father's hands shook as he slammed his glass down, wine spilling across the tablecloth. Lies, he barked, but his voice cracked. I met his gaze unflinching. Look at the account numbers. Look at the dates. This is my work, my money, my sacrifice. And while you praised your son, I carried you all in silence. My mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Daniel pushed back his chair, stammering. I meant to pay it back, he muttered weakly, but the words fell flat. The cousins who once looked at him with admiration now turned with disgust. An uncle shook his head. An aunt whispered, all this time. The silence that followed was thicker than any storm. I pulled out one last document, a deed. I held it up, the paper trembling only slightly in my hand. "And this," I said, "my voice rising, is proof that the roof over your heads, the house you boast about, belongs to me. I bought it. I saved it. I own it. Not Daniel. Not father. Me." Gasps rippled again, louder this time. My father's face went red, his pride collapsing under the weight of truth. He opened his mouth, but no words came. My mother sank into a chair, sobbing quietly. Daniel buried his face in his hands. The room felt suspended, every eye fixed on me, the overlooked daughter who had finally stepped into the light. I let the silence stretch the truth, sinking into every corner of that house. Then I spoke the words that had burned inside me for years. "You called daughters useless. You erased me, diminished me, ignored me. But tonight, you will remember this. It was the daughter who saved you, and without me, you would have lost everything." My voice broke slightly, not from weakness, but from the release of decades of pain. The relatives erupted not in applause, but in a chorus of disbelief, judgment whispers tearing through the room. My father sat down heavily, staring at the papers as though they were knives. My mother reached for me with shaking hands, whispering, "Rachel, I'm sorry." But the words felt too late, too small. Daniel muttered excuses, promises, apologies, but no one listened. The illusion had shattered. The truth stood undeniable in black and white. I gathered the folder, slowly sliding the documents back inside. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each relative. "This is not revenge," I said, my voice steady. "This is justice. And tonight you all saw it." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving the room in stunned silence, the weight of revelation crashing down on those who had once called me worthless. The silence of that Christmas night echoed long after I left the house. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked to my car, the folder pressed tightly to my chest, but the noise behind me had shifted forever. In the days that followed, the ripple effect was impossible to ignore. Relatives who once nodded politely at my father began to speak more openly, some calling to apologize for their silence, others sending quiet notes of admiration for my courage. My father, once the untouchable patriarch, became the subject of whispers in the community. Neighbors who had heard him boast for years about his successful son now looked at him with pity or disdain, knowing the truth that had been exposed. His pride, once ironclad, had cracked. He avoided gatherings, retreating into the house that no longer felt like his. For the first time in his life, he had to sit in the shadow of his own arrogance. Daniel's downfall was even sharper. His friends, many of whom had loaned him money under promises of imminent returns, turned against him. Calls for repayment grew louder. Lawsuits threatened, and the easy smile he once wore disappeared. Without my silent bailouts, he faced the full weight of the consequences he had always been shielded from. I heard through cousins that he moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, his reputation shredded. The golden child had become a cautionary tale. My mother struggled in ways that cut deeper than words. She reached out to me often, her voice shaking, asking to meet for coffee, to talk, to apologize. I agreed, once sitting across from her in a quiet diner. She cried into her napkin, saying she had always known the truth, but had been too afraid to stand against my father. Her tears were real, her regret heavy, but I realized something in that moment. I no longer needed her apology to validate me. The years of silence could not be undone, and while I forgave her, I also accepted the distance that would remain. Forgiveness was for my peace, not for rebuilding what had been broken. At work, I felt a strange new freedom. The secret weight of carrying my family had been lifted, the hidden payments revealed. I no longer had to smile politely at lies or pretend I was unaffected by their dismissal. My colleagues noticed the change, the lightness in my step, the confidence that had been forged not only by professional success, but by personal vindication. When my boss offered me a directorship, I accepted with steady hands, knowing I had earned it not only in the office but in the battlefield of my own family. Back in Pennsylvania, my father grew quieter. His health declined, stress etched into his face. People who once admired him now avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the man who had scorned his daughter while living under her roof. The irony was sharp. The daughter he dismissed had become the very foundation of his survival, and now the world knew it. He never said the words I longed to hear, never admitted he was wrong, But sometimes silence is its own confession. My mother remained caught between her roles torn by love for her son and shame for her choices. She visited me in New York once, standing awkwardly in my apartment, eyes lingering on the framed degrees and photos of my life she had never asked about. She whispered that she was proud, and though it was late, I held on to those words as a fragile step forward. The wider family dynamic shifted too. Cousins who had once idolized Daniel began to seek my advice, asking how to manage their own finances, how to pursue education. I realized that by exposing the truth, I had not only reclaimed my dignity, but also reshaped the narrative for the next generation. The little girls in our family who once heard my father's words about daughters being useless now had a different story to hold on to, the story of a daughter who saved everything. As months passed, I visited less. The house no longer felt like home, and I no longer sought validation from its walls. Instead, I built my own traditions, my own celebrations, surrounded by friends and chosen family who valued me for who I was, not for the role I was denied. I realized that the true consequence of that night was not just their shame, but my freedom. For the first time, I no longer carried the invisible burden of proving myself. I had proven enough. The family that once erased me had been forced to see me, and whether they liked it or not, they would never forget it. Healing did not come overnight. For weeks after that Christmas, I carried the weight of years like stones in my chest, replaying every word my father had ever thrown at me, every silence my mother had chosen, every smirk from my brother, as he basked in praise that was never his. But something had shifted. The night I laid those documents on the table was not just about exposing lies, it was about reclaiming myself. For the first time, I felt the sharp edges of their judgment dull, replaced by the certainty that I was no longer defined by their blindness. I chose to step into therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to ensure that the scars of my family did not dictate the rest of my life. Sitting across from a therapist who listened without judgment, I found words for the pain I had carried since childhood. Naming it was liberating. The shame was not mine to hold. Slowly, I built a life outside their shadow. My apartment became a sanctuary, walls lined with books, framed photos of colleagues who had become friends, and reminders of the victories I had earned on my own terms. I hosted small dinners with people who valued honesty over appearances, who lifted glasses to real accomplishments rather than illusions. These gatherings, warm and genuine, became the family I chose. My grandmother's memory guided me often. I would sit with her old notebook in my lap, the one she gave me as a child, its pages filled with her handwriting and pressed flowers. It reminded me that someone had always believed in me, even when others refused. When spring came, I took a trip to her favorite park, scattering petals by the pond, whispering my gratitude into the breeze. It felt like closing a circle, honoring the ally who had planted the seed of my strength. Professionally, I flourished. Promotions followed not as rewards for survival, but as recognition of skill. I led teams, mentored younger women, and made sure no daughter in my orbit ever doubted her worth. I spoke openly at conferences about resilience, about the quiet battles fought in families and workplaces, and I saw heads nod, eyes glisten. My story was not just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever been silenced, diminished, or overlooked. As for my parents, their lives grew smaller. My father's health waned, his voice no longer booming with false pride. He never apologized, never uttered the words I once longed to hear, but sometimes silence is a confession more powerful than speech. My mother reached out more often, her words halting but sincere, telling me she admired me, that she wished she had been braver. I listened sometimes, I answered sometimes, I let the silence speak for me. Forgiveness came not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet acceptance that I could not rewrite the past, only free myself from it. Daniel drifted further away, swallowed by debts and bad choices. Occasionally, I heard about him through others, his name now synonymous with squandered chances. The golden child was gone, replaced by the truth everyone now knew. I felt no joy in his fall, only a detached clarity. Each of us reaped what we had sown, and me, I chose to sow dignity. The epilogue of my story is simple yet profound. I learned that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet endurance that outlasts the storm. I discovered that blood does not define, family actions do. and I embraced the truth that dignity is not given, it is claimed. Tonight, as you watch this, I want to leave you with this. If you have ever been overlooked, mocked, or dismissed, remember my story. Remember that silence can be broken, that truth has a way of surfacing, and that your worth is not diminished by the blindness of others. You have the power to reclaim your narrative, no matter how late, no matter how heavy the years. Before I close, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments because I want to know your story too. If you have ever faced favoritism in your family, if you have ever been told you are less, share it. Let us turn this space into a community where dignity is restored and voices are heard. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button so it reaches more people who may need to hear it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of justice and redemption. For those of you over 50 who know the long weight of family traditions and the scars they leave, know that it is never too late to choose peace, to build boundaries, to find healing. Thank you for listening, for being part of this journey. My name is Rachel Miller, and though my family once called me useless, I stand before you now, whole, free, and unshakably certain of my worth.